Statistically speaking, December was a pretty average reading month for me, and it definitely felt that way. Like, I read a decent amount of books, I enjoyed some, somewhat okay, and I didn't really have any particularly strong feelings about anything. I did participate in the Clear Your Shit readathon. As always, I did not finish. I have still yet to actually complete a year. I also participated in G's Lightfall readathon, which is the Christmas round of Magical Readathon, which I did like a 1 week vlog for. And overall, time just got away from me a little bit. You know what it's like. There's Christmas prep to be off, like to have some time off means that I spend more time working earlier in the month. And then during the Christmas break, when I expected to catch up, I started watching a K-drama, which is by far my favorite thing that I consumed. Let's not talk about the books. The favorite thing that I consumed in December was Lovely Runner, which is a 16 episode, 1 season K-drama. All of the episodes were like an hour long, so over the course of I think about 5 days I watched all 16 hours of that, and reading fell by the wayside a little bit. I also, as you will see in the upcoming vlog, like I did a lot of hobby stuff, a lot of crafting stuff, and had just like a generally great time, and I don't regret it. But in terms of our statistics for December, I read a total of 3,536 pages across 8 books, which breaks down to an average of 114 pages per day. For the star ratings, I only had 1 2-star read this month. I had 3 3-stars and 4 4-stars, which breaks down to an average of 3.37 stars per book. For the demographics, I read 1 young adult, 1 new adult, and 6 adult books. For the formats, I read 7 standardly formatted novels and I listened to 1 audiobook. For the genres, I read 4 fantasy books, 2 romance, 1 fantasy romance, and 1 mystery. And finally, for the places where I sourced these books from, 4 of them were books that I had hauled in 2024, 3 of them were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2024, and 1 was a book that I had borrowed from my library. So the first thing that I did in the month was film episode 11 of Shelve It or Scrap It, and in that episode I managed to read a couple of Christmas romances. Now, these were actually the 1st and the 4th books that I read in the month, but I am going to talk about them together because they are pretty much exactly the same book. So the first one that I read was Make You Mine This Christmas by Lizzie Huxley Jones. This one is about a girl who has forgotten that her parents have gone away for Christmas. They've gone abroad, and she doesn't want to kind of force herself upon her roommate. So she goes to this Christmas party and she meets this guy and they're having like a silly goofy time. They kiss under the mistletoe, and his ex-girlfriend actually sees this happen and tells his parents, because they were essentially like childhood sweethearts. And so his parents then text him and say that he has to bring this girl home for Christmas. So he doesn't want to seem like a failure because he has like issues with his father and like the things that he wants for his future that don't necessarily align with what his parents want for him. So he pretty much begs this girl to go home with him for the Christmas break, and she agrees because obviously she has nowhere else to go. However, on the way to his family home, she stops at a bookstore, I think it's in St. Pancras Station, and she meets this girl that she pretty much instantly falls in love with, only to find out that it is this guy that she's fake dating's sister, and they are trapped in this family home, this like small village, for about 5 days with all of these like conflicted feelings going on. Now, Kiss Her Once for me, as I said, pretty much exactly the same book. Our main character in this one is an illustrator, or is it an animator? She got her dream job anyway, and one Christmas Eve she met this woman, and over a course of like 12 hours they fell madly in love. They got snowed in, they walked through the city when it was snowing, and they had like this perfect romantic isolated night. However, in the morning our main character left and they never spoke again. So I can't remember if this is 1 or 2 years on from that, but our main character has since lost her job and she's working as a barista. She's going for this promotion at work, however she hates her boss and he hates her, so it's very unlikely she's going to get it. And when she's kind of crying about her financial woes at work, the landlord that owns the unit that the coffee shop is in overhears her, and he hatches a plan that is going to work out for both of them, because he has an inheritance that his grandfather has stipulated that he can only inherit if he marries, and obviously our main character needs money, so he says, if you marry me then I will give you like a certain amount of money from this inheritance, and the only stipulations are that nobody can find out that the marriage is fake. They're only going to be married for like a year and then get divorced, and that she has to accompany him home for the Christmas break. Lo and behold, when she arrives at his family home, she She finds out that his sister is the woman that she had that perfect magical 24-hour, 12-hour Christmas Eve with. Chaos ensues. So as you can see, we have two very similar plots here. Now, Make You Mine This Christmas is set in the UK, predominantly in York, and I can't remember where, but somewhere down south. You know, like where the rich people live in the countryside. It's one of those places. And Kiss Her Once For Me is set in Oregon, Portland, because the girl, the main character, is very much modeled off Zooey Deschanel, which is how I remembered that. So we have two different settings here, but I would say that the plots, the story beats are very, very similar. Now, they are both Christmas romances, so they both have that Hallmark-esque feel, and I did give both of these 4 stars. I would say that Make You Mine This Christmas is more of a 3.5, whereas this one is solidly a 4. So if you were to only read one of these, I would recommend Kiss Her Once For Me. The key difference between these two is that I find the romance a little bit more believable in Kiss Her Once For Me, and I'm also rooting for the couple a little bit more in this one, because in Make You Mine This Christmas, there were a couple of conflicts that I felt were resolved a little bit too easily that kind of hinted at deeper foundational problems, I would say, in a possible romance. Both of these, like, as we know, romances always end in a happily ever after or a happy for now, and I feel like the development of the relationship in Kiss Her Once For Me was more believable given the amount of time that the characters had known each other and the amount of time they'd spent with each other, as opposed to Make You Mine This Christmas, where the timeline of the meeting to the happily ever after or the happy for now is less than a 5-day period. I think that Make You Mine This Christmas was a little bit more humorous, especially if you are from the UK. It had a lot of British humour in it, which I really appreciated. And I also appreciated the locations of this one because it is like predominantly set in York. But I think in terms of me as somebody who is from the UK, when I think of picturesque Christmas settings and Hallmark-esque stories, I definitely think of the US a little bit more because most of the Hallmark-esque media that we're consuming is produced in the US. So in terms of the Christmas vibes, I think Kiss Her Once For Me was a little bit stronger on that front as well. But two definitely solid romances. I think that if you like one, you will like the other. These are the only two Christmas romances that I own. They came from subscription boxes, 2 separate subscription boxes. This one was the Afterlight, which is Illumicrate's romance subscription, and this one came from Book of the Month. So it was just a massive coincidence that I ended up with both of them, and they're the only 2 Christmas romances I own. They were also both published in the same year, so it's not like one copied the other one either. The next book I read for Shelve It or Scrap It was In the Ravenous Dark by A.M. Strickland. This one was a fantasy book that started off strong but very much tapered off in the second half, the second 2/3 for me, mainly because this one is a standalone fantasy story, and I feel like because of that it felt very abridged. So this one is set in a city called Thonopolis, and there is a blight in the outer world. So this city is covered by a dome to protect the inhabitants from this blight. We have blood mages in here, which form the dominant form of magic in this world, and in Thonopolis specifically, the blood mages are highly coveted and their bloodlines are very strictly curated. So our main character, when she was young, saw her father captured by the military of this world because he had blood magic that he was hiding. He was actually from a place outside of this city, but because he had a powerful bloodline, the royalty and the military, like the government of this world, wanted to bring him in so that they could also curate his bloodline. So our main character has been taught that she must always hide her own blood magic. However, when there is an accident and she reacts kind of instinctually using her magic to save her friend, she is brought into the higher workings of this society and kind of trained and prepared to take on the bloodline of her family. And in this world, like, your bloodline is kind of inked on your skin, or the blood is brought to the surface to form like a kind of tattoo. Part of the process of accepting the magic in this world is that you are tied to this like spiritual warrior who is somebody who is not alive, like they teeter between life and death. They're like a spectre, and they are set to guard you not only from outside threats to yourself, but to guard other people from you if you choose to use your magic for nefarious purposes. So this one is also a queer fantasy, and we do have a polyamorous relationship in here. There are multiple different romantic threads that are explored, and I do also feel like that was to the detriment of this book because it is a standalone fantasy and it's not a thick one by any means. I liked that we had a more complex complex fantasy world and that it felt like one that A.M. Strickland had thought a lot about. However, I do feel like this world exceeded past the boundaries of this narrative. So while I appreciated how rich the world building was, the narrative and plotline did not do a good job of using this world to its fullest. So what happened is I kind of went into this with a great deal of hope and optimism because I love the world building, but I was very disappointed by the plotline when it didn't make use of all of this intricate world building that the author had done. I would say that a decent amount of the beginning of this book as well is spent on that world building, and my main kind of inkling that things weren't going the way that I maybe wanted to was that it felt like a lot was happening in between the chapters. Like, it felt very much abridged. We would have one thing happen in our main character's perspective, and then when we came back to her, like a week had passed, or she would be being told about something that had happened in between the two chapters, and it did very much feel like you were missing chunks of this book. Circling back to the romantic relationships as well, one of my main issues with this is that we have some development with one of the romantic relationships in here, and I was rooting for that one because we had that level of development, that level of banter and like rapport that was established before this relationship turned romantic. And then the other romantic interest that we pursue in here has absolutely no development at all. They meet and the romance is just there. Like, there is no build up, there's no tension. And so as somebody who likes to see those relationships grow when I'm reading, I had pretty much no attachment to this book. It is one of those as well that falls into the category of an impulsive main character whose main motivations for her actions are dictated by the relationships that she has with the people around her. However, because of the length of this book, because it was a standalone, I felt that a lot of the actions that the main character was taking were not especially believable or were exceedingly rash, even for an impulsive main character, based on the level of attachment that I felt that she had to the characters around her because of the lack of development for some of the relationships in here. It was just a little bit too fast, it felt a little bit disjointed, and it felt like chunks were missing. So while I feel like this had a very strong start, I think that this would have done way better as a duology, or at least with like an extra 100 to 200 pages added in, because it isn't long at all for a fantasy book. It's 390 pages, so I mean, I would say typically the average book, especially a fantasy, is 400, so it's not even hitting that page mark, and it being a standalone I think was just far too ambitious for this story. On the flip side of that, one that I expected to feel super ambivalent about but actually ended up really loving was 5 Broken Blades by Mai Corland. So this is one that I had heard very mid reviews about. The synopsis of this one sounded amazing, but everything that I kind of heard is that it falls a little bit flat. So that's the level of expectation that I went into this book with. This one is a heist story. It is kind of reminiscent of Six of Crows in that it is a heist story. Like, we have a collection of criminals, people who are down on their luck, who are specifically curated and assembled to perform a task, and the task that they have been assigned is to kill the king. I would say that another way that it's reminiscent of heist stories like specifically Six of Crows is that everybody is romantically paired up throughout here, and I would say that it feels very classic YA in that regard specifically, which I feel has led to a lot of the kind of mediocre reviews that this book has received. However, I just really enjoyed it. In this one, we are following 6 characters. 5 of them have been tasked with killing the king, and one of them is just accompanying one of the other members of this party. So we have a girl who is a slave, and the duke that owns her is the person who has tasked her with killing the king. She has been trained as an assassin at his elite and very secret assassin school, and the reason why she has agreed to this is because he has said that he will free her and her sister from their servitude should they accomplish this mission, and he has also sent his son along with her under the guise of freeing her when her mission is complete, like burning her contract of servitude. We are also following a prince who is the brother of the king that is to be murdered, and he was exiled from his kingdom because he murdered a bunch of people, so valid, and he is traveling with the royal spy master who has come to get him out of hiding because he requires his specific skill set to, of course, murder the king. And then our last pair that we're following is a girl who has a very secret backstory backstory. She's a little bit coy, a little bit more secretive than the rest of them. And she has been actually hired by the spy master to kill the king. So she is making her way to their rendezvous point, and she hires essentially like a mercenary to protect her along the way. So the synopsis of this one is one that sounded super appealing to me. So I was a little bit disappointed when I was seeing those mediocre early reviews come in. And I do admit, like, I agree with all of the criticism that this book has received, especially when it comes down to the romance, because yes, all of these characters are romantically entangled, and there is not even any mystery about who they are romantically entangled with, because it is the pairings. Like, immediately, as soon as all of these characters are thrown together, there is immediate attraction between them, and that is just the pairing that we run with through the entirety of this book. I also don't think that this book does anything that has not been done before. I think that it utilizes tropes, themes, plot structures that we are very familiar with traditionally from young adult fantasy, and it executes them in a way that is nothing new, nothing unique, nothing overly exciting, but very, in my opinion, well done within the bounds that we expect from all of these elements. It is an adult fantasy as well, and I think that some of the criticisms that this book receives is that it uses a lot of plot devices and tropes from young adults. However, I wouldn't disagree with this book being adult. It does slightly elevate all of these topics just a little bit. To me, it just felt very reminiscent of things that I've loved in the past, and it executed it in a way that I enjoyed. As well as that, there is an audiobook for this, and it is a full cast, which, as you all know, is one of my favorite things. Somewhere in the middle of Shelf It or Scrap It, I read Knife of Dreams by Robert Jordan, which is book 11 in the Wheel of Time series. We are back in the chunky installments of this series, and to be fair, the page count on this one was a little bit more warranted because it was one that I enjoyed a little bit more in this series. So obviously I'm 11 books deep into Wheel of Time now, so I can't give you an especially detailed synopsis or breakdown of what happened in this particular installment, but the overarching plot of this one is that we are following a classic struggle between the forces of light and dark. This is a world where everything happens over and over again in every age of the world, and as the Wheel of Time has been turning, the world has been turning more away from the light and towards the dark. So in this series, we are following this age's iteration of the Dragon Reborn, which is a consistent pivotal figure within this epic struggle, as he, hopefully, fingers crossed, turns the world towards the forces of light for good. He does have a little bit of help with this. There are a handful of Tarviran, who are people who are able to alter the weave of the world and the pattern of events that will happen, as well as a whole host of other characters that kind of join this struggle along the way. So I have had my issues with this series, and honestly I still do have some issues with this series. I think that Robert Jordan is a very good storyteller, but I don't necessarily think that he is a very good writer, because I feel like all of the elements that he has in here, the way that the plot is coming together or the way that the elements of the plot fit together is great. However, I feel like the way that Robert Jordan delivers them is not the most compelling way, not the most intricate, seamless way of presenting this story. He tends to spend long blocks of time on individual elements, and then it can be like 2 to 3 books before you revisit them. So he's giving you the base knowledge that you need, he's laying the groundwork, but he's not doing a good enough job, in my opinion, of keeping those elements constant, present, at the forefront, relevant, so that by the time you revisit them 3 books later, you actually kind of understand the relevance of them at that point, especially because back in the day there will have been people who were just reading these books as they were coming out, and that is a long time. Like, that is 3 or 4 years before we've revisited this last plot point that all of a sudden is relevant, but we haven't actually seen it or mentioned it at all for the last 4 books. So the last 5 books, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 that I have read have been exceptionally slow. They are what people refer to as the slump era of this series, and I definitely agree, although I feel like it was 7, 8, and 9, or 8, 9, and 10, I feel, were the real rough points. And so it was a little bit refreshing to get to Knife of Dreams, where I felt like we finally had a culmination of all of these things that had been mentioned and dragged on for the last 4 books in a way that was a little bit more exciting than anything I've read over the last few months of this series. That being said, it is hard for me to continue to be enthusiastic about this series after having read so much that I'm ambivalent about. So at this point, at Knife of Dreams, while I really enjoyed some of the things that were brought to the forefront in this one, especially as they tied into theories that I'd had like books and books and books ago. I am no longer at a point where I feel like I can truly be invested in this series because I have spent so long being disinterested that it's hard for me to kind of reignite my interest and care again at this point. So I gave this one 3 stars because I definitely acknowledge that it was more interesting and better than what I've read over the last 5 books, but I'm not a massive fan of Wheel of Time yet. There's 3 books to go, all of them written by Brandon Sanderson, so there is time, but it's looking unlikely for me, I'm afraid. I am unsure whether this is going to be on my worst books of the year list. I guess you'll find out in like a week, but this is definitely one of the most disappointing books that I have read this year. While it's not terrible, I had very high expectations and it did not meet them at all, and that is The End in Fire by Sarah El-Arifi, which is the 3rd book in the End in Fire trilogy. So you will know whenever I talk about this series, I always say how the Final Strife book 1 in this series is the best new fantasy that I have read in forever. I was blown away by book 1. I did only give it 4 stars because I do feel like there were flaws, but Sarah El-Arifi at that point was a debut author, so that's not like a huge deal. But what I really loved was the way that she constructed the plot and the world throughout book 1 and 2. So essentially the Final Strife is set in this world where people are segregated by the colours of their blood. So you have the red bloods, who are the nobility of the world, you have the blue bloods, who are a little bit lower than a working class, and then you have the translucent bloods, who are the servants and the slaves of the world. The main catalyst of this plot is that there is a rebellion that happened about 20 years before the start of the series, where the rebels swapped a bunch of red-blooded children with blue-blooded children so that they could raise the red bloods amongst the lower classes and show them the oppression that they were facing, so that these children would have a drive to change that. And then they were going to train them to be entered into a series of trials that happens every 10 years to select the next rulers of the world to put these red children in power and change the world for good. So good idea, right? However, the rebellion has failed. So we are following one main character who is a red-blooded child that has been raised amongst the blue bloods, and she has lost all of her purpose in life with the failure of this rebellion and is currently a drug addict. We are also following a blue-blooded child who was raised amongst the reds, and the only reason that they kept her alive is because it would be embarrassing if anybody found out that this specific family was infiltrated by the rebellion, and her family members absolutely hate her and like emotionally and psychologically abuse her. And then we are also following one of the translucent blooded main characters who is facing the most oppression in this world as somebody who is forming one of the lowest or the lowest class of this world. Book 1 had an isolated plot. It mainly centered around the tournament that picks the next leaders of the world, and it just left a little bit like you wanting just a little bit more and hinting towards a little bit more in this world. Book 2 took that little nugget of intrigue and ran with it and massively expanded the world with plot twists that honestly blew my mind. So I expected so much from book 3 that I just did not get. I gave this book 2 stars. I was so disappointed. I feel like if this was not the 3rd book in this series, I would have DNF'd it. And to be honest, if I had made it to the end, it probably would have been a 3. But I feel like the quality of this is so much lower than the other 2 books in this series that it deserves that slightly lower rating, because we just went nowhere with this book. I can't even put my finger on what the issue is. It just was missing a spark, and it is the same spark that was missing when I read Fairbound by Sarah El-Arifi, where I read it and I was like, okay, this has a lot of good elements. I am enjoying this, but there is just something missing. You know that feeling when you're reading a book that you're about to become obsessed with, and it's just a feeling. You don't know why you're having that feeling, but something just clicks. I had that feeling throughout book 1 and 2 in this series, and it is a feeling that I was sorely lacking in The End in Fire. However, the last 15% of this book was very good, and I would say matched the standards of book 1 and 2. So it feels to me like Sarah El-Arifi knew where she needed this series to end, but struggled to get there. Like, I just felt no connection to the characters, no investment in the plot. After the first 20% of this, up until that final 15, I would say that I was very bored. I was overwhelmingly bored throughout the middle of this, and it just really lacked that little bit of something special puzzle that kept me so enamored with books 1 and 2 in this series, and I don't really know what the issue was here. The characters were infuriating, but they always have been infuriating. I feel like that's why this hasn't been a 5-star series for me in books 1 and 2, because the characters are impulsive and rash, and some of them are immature. Some of them will always make the wrong choices, which is fine in terms of like they're consistent and true to their characters that have been established. They're just not my favorite kind of characters, so they're not 5-star characters for me. But I feel like the level of infuriation I felt, especially regarding Honor in here, was next level. Like it was more infuriating than it had been through the final 2 books, and I feel like we had a regression almost in some of the characters. Some of the growth that we'd had over the last 2 books kind of just disappeared, and while their actions and their motivations are kind of consistent with their characters in a way and could be explained, it is almost like they were running on autopilot and they weren't actually thinking about any of these situations that they ended up in. Something that actually did really annoy me in this one is that we have a main character in here who is an addict, and something that I have really enjoyed about this series going throughout it is that addiction never goes away. Like even through various stages of recovery and relapse, there is always some element of that addiction present. However, when we had a similar situation established with a different character in this book, it disappeared instantly. Like it just became a non-issue, and that was incredibly frustrating when I feel like it was one of the strengths of this series earlier down the line. I then got my monthly fix of the Pretty Little Liars series, and I read book 9, which was Twisted by Sarah Shepard. This is of course the book series that the TV show was based on. It's following a group of girls whose friend goes missing and their friendship pretty much dissolves. However, a couple of years later they are brought back together when they start receiving a string of threatening and anonymous text messages from somebody who just signs off as A for anonymous, or potentially Allison, which is the name of the friend that disappeared. I think that these have been a really good time. They are amazing palette cleansers for me. I feel like this series and YA mystery thrillers in general does for me what fun contemporary romance does for other people. Like it's just a fun, silly, goofy time. It is wildly overdramatic. There is a lot of problematic elements in here because of the time that it was published, but I'm just having a really great time with this series. This one marked the first book of the 3rd story arc of the series overall, but also the first book of the 2nd half, which was never intended to exist. So I'm pretty sure, I did a small amount of research, but I'm pretty sure that Sarah Shepard wrote the entirety of this series. However, she did intend to finish after book 8, and I'm assuming because of the popularity of the show. Oh, was it published before? 2011, so I think the show started in 2009 or 10. She ended up writing 8 more books. At this point, it's too early into those books, obviously, because I've only read 1 book, to say whether these books were necessary, whether they work. I have heard that the series goes downhill in the 2nd half. There is a small time jump between book 8 and book 9 of around about a year, I think. So far, all I can really say is that nothing really happened in this installment. It was still enjoyable. It was still overdramatic, unrealistic, ridiculous, but a real good time. I still like Sarah Shepard's writing, but I feel like it was a little bit anticlimactic. But then because it is the first book of like the next 8 books, I feel like with the time jump, we were really establishing where these characters are now before we get into the action, is my hope. I mean, one of the kind of annoying things about this is that it kept referencing something that happened that we don't know about. So they went on vacation to Jamaica, I think, in spring break, and every few pages it was like, oh, we don't talk about the thing that happened in Jamaica, and the only thing that you really find out in this book is what happened, and it turned out to be pretty anticlimactic in my opinion. However, because I did still enjoy it, I gave it 3 stars, but it's definitely one of the weaker books in this series so far. And then the final book that I read was the first book for my new Patreon book club series, which was Lady of Darkness by Melissa K. Roweridge. So this one was one of the hyped fantasy romance series of 2024, and it was one that I was eager to try out for myself, and I'm happy to say that I did enjoy it because it can always go either way with me. This one is very reminiscent of Throne of Glass in my opinion. We are following a young assassin called Scarlet who has some trauma in her background that we keep referencing that happened around a year before the start of this story, and since then she has been estranged a little bit from the assassin assassin lord that took her in after her mother died and trained her. Since then, she has been living on the estate of a lord, kind of taken in as a ward situation, and she is called back to the assassin lord's side when he offers her a mission that will ultimately lead to her revenge for the death of her mother at the hands of the Fey Fire Prince. However, things start to get a little bit complicated when children begin to go missing in the Syndicate, which is the area of the city that is ruled by like the assassins and the thieves, and Scarlet is tasked to investigate this to try and find out who is taking the children and what are the reasons behind it. It is something that was happening a year ago, however they believe that they had solved the issue because it has been such a long time since any children have gone missing, and kind of unwillingly Scarlet ends up assisted by the captain of like the special forces of the Kingsguard, who is the dominant male main character in this one. It is a dual perspective. I think we do only, oh no, we briefly have a third perspective, but it's mainly two perspectives, which is this captain and mainly obviously our main character Scarlet. This has all of the elements of Throne of Glass. They are in a slightly different order, and instead of being introduced gradually like they are throughout the Throne of Glass series, they're all kind of thrown in at once. So we have all of the key Throne of Glass male main characters in here. I would say our female main character even looks like Selena, but our male main characters, we have a prince who has had a past romantic relationship with the main character, which forms a little bit of tension and angst in this one. We have the Fey Lord character represented, who forms the main kind of blossoming romance throughout this book. And then we also have the assassin friend that's like the childhood best friend, where feelings are running a little bit deeper as well. It doesn't necessarily feel like a rip-off of Throne of Glass. Either that or I've just got so used to series being similar to Sarah J Maas at this point that I don't really bat an eye and I kind of just roll with it, because I actually really did enjoy this one and I gave it 4 stars. I do feel like it has a very slow start, and actually that is something that I typically enjoy when it comes to fantasy romance. However, in this one I did feel like it got a little bit tedious towards the middle, because it wasn't just that things were moving slowly, it was that our main characters were rehashing the same points over and over again. There comes to a point where they're kind of having a disagreement over one particular thing that Scarlet wants to know that the male main character won't tell her, and so every time they meet she asks him the same question and he says that he's not going to tell her, and then they just like go off in a huff again. And this happens through, I want to say, like a good 200 pages of this book, so I was kind of antsy for it to get moving, for us to progress a little bit at that point. And by the end of it I did get to a point where I was kind of invested and I was eager to move on to book 2. So I do think that my enjoyment of this was derailed a little bit because of how obsessed with Lovely Runner I was at the time that I was reading this, because I then kind of started to get into the mood for contemporary romance, which meant that this is not the thing that I wanted to read in the moment. So I feel like if I'd have read it at a slightly different time I would have enjoyed it a little bit more. That being said, I did still give it 4 stars, so I did have a good time with it. It's like a low 4 teetering between a 3 and a 4. Something that I did kind of get very frustrated with though in this one is that I feel like there's a massive spoiler in the synopsis, and I'm not going to tell you what it is because I don't want to draw attention to it. And I actually, because I mentioned this in my vlog, when I went back and I read the synopsis I realized that it doesn't explicitly say the thing that I thought that it said in the synopsis, but I think it's so obvious that it might as well have done. Like, just the way that it's phrased, I feel like it spoils a key element of this book. And in my opinion, it is obvious as soon as you start this book what exact configuration of things we have at play is going to form the main part of this plot. But the reason why the synopsis being worded the way that it was so frustrating to me is because the thing that I believe it spoils forms the key mystery of this book, and I put that in quotations because it is pretty apparent. It is heavily implied, it is heavily hinted at throughout the entirety of this, to the point where as soon as it was introduced I kind of knew what was going on, but it's only actually explicitly revealed on the page right at the very end of the book. So take from that what you will. It was fine because, like I said, it was so obvious as soon as it was introduced as an element that it wasn't ever really a mystery for me. It was like low-key tension. Like, I see that we're trying to create tension here, but I know what the tension is, so like it is what it is. You know, like when you know that characters are about to be forced into a certain situation, like, you know, if you have two characters that are romantically interested in each other and they are approaching an inn, you know there's only going to be one bed there. So it was that kind of thing where like it does still create tension, but you know what's coming. And I feel like it would have been just a smidge more of a mystery if certain elements of the synopsis weren't worded the way that they were. So those are all of the books that I read in December. It was a decent month in terms of quantity. In quality, it was fine. I keep saying that I want to get to a point where I'm reading better books, but honestly, I don't know how to, because a lot of these are a lot of books that I've been reading that I haven't been loving. Like, I'm reading one right now, which I expect to be a 4 or a 5 star, and I'm considering DNFing it. So I honestly just don't know how to pick books that I know I'm going to enjoy at this point, because even when I do pick up something that I feel like is an easy win, it's normally like a hard no. So I don't know how we're going to rectify that in the future, but down in my comments, let me know what your last book that you read in 2024 was. For me, it was Lady of Darkness. And if you guys would like to let me know you were here but you don't feel like you have very much to say, please leave a blue emoji down in the comments for Lady of Darkness, just so I can see that you were here. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you will find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram, and my Patreon if you'd like to join me on any of those. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.